It's the old soldier back again from my little garden here in New Brunswick, Canada. And I'm going to address a question which is often asked to me, and I think it's a really important question for us to wrap our heads around. And that question is, what do I do about my struggles with low self esteem? The reason this question is so important is because it's one of those first principles questions. And if you have followed my conversation along, one of the things that I talked about initially was the fundamental, foundational importance of what we base our moral ethical framework and our worldview on. And this is one of those ideas which is a first principle idea, and it is also fundamentally unnatural. It is not a natural human interface with the world and with themselves. This idea of self esteem is a very modern idea. It was really coined and established by William James, who was one of the pioneers of psychology, the first man to actually teach psychology in the United States of America, and it was developed in the late 1800s. So if you think that the idea of self-esteem is a natural way to look at yourself, what you would find if you went backwards in human thought is that it's more or less completely absent from history the way that it is currently understood. That's super important for us to understand and to wrap our head around, because nobody looked at themselves in the way that modern psychology tells you to look at yourself in regards to this concept of self-esteem. Now, some people would put David Hume as the originator of self-esteem, to push it back into the mid to late 1700s. I think it's a bit of a stretch. I've read David Hume on self-love. He does certainly argue for an intrinsically and inherently good human nature, but he does also seem to despise self love unless it is the kind of self love that drives people to love others. I think it's a bit of a stretch to take that to self esteem. So, what you're talking about is about a 150-year-old concept that was derived in the United States of America and has more or less overtaken Western society's understanding of themselves and their interface with reality. And it has divorced you from the traditional concept in really every society that self worth is derived from self accomplishment and virtue. The the fundamental principle of self esteem establishes that you have self esteem based on your understanding of belonging and based on your understanding of, or your perception of belonging, or your perception of mastery of your environment. So the concepts here are that I feel good if people accept me, and I feel good if I feel like I'm having an impact in the world and I'm able to profitably impact the world that I live in. Those are the two principles that are the main ideas of understanding self esteem in the psychological framework. Now, compare that to the traditional understanding of self worth being tied to virtue in your life. What you need to understand is that every society did this. There's Egypt, the ancient Egyptians had a list of virtues that uh, more or less dictated whether or not you are a good person, a person of worth. The ideas were truth, balance, order, law, morality, and justice. Ancient Chinese society under Confucianism had the ideas of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and fidelity. Hinduism, much more variable because it depended upon sort of which of the polytheistic gods you worshipped, but all of the pagan religions and the polytheistic religions had the idea, at the very least, that your worth was tied to your accomplishment of the virtues that were understood by that society. And this is true of Buddhism. This is true of ancient Greek Western thought. Certainly, Platonic philosophy from Plato had a number of virtues as well: temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. Aristotelian, uh, Aristotle wrote 12 virtues that governed a man's worth and accomplishment in the world. The Romans had a great many virtues. Now, mind you, in Latin, virtue simply means manliness. It's one of what we would call the virtues today. But there are many different virtues that they looked at and considered to be the things that were the measure of a man or a woman. So, this is fundamentally important for you to understand that it doesn't matter which religious or social framework you look at, until the late 1800s, there was not a society that ever said something like the self-esteem Facebook meme, like "you are good enough, you deserve good things, you are smart enough, you are worthy of love and respect, you are amazing just the way you are." Are you? Well, on what grounds? Like, what does that even mean? Uh, how can you tell me that I'm amazing just the way that I am? Maybe I'm a serial killer, dude. Like, do you think that, I mean, I guess that's amazing in one way, not a good way, right? People might be amazed at the atrocities I commit. But you can't say that. You can't say that someone is worthy of love and respect and amazing just the way that they are. What if they're a child abuser? What if they're, fundamentally flawed in all of their relationships and they're abusive and nobody really believes that? Do you understand the problem here? Um, how about, you are exactly perfect, exactly as you are, with all your flaws and problems. There's no need to change anything. All you need to change is the thought that you have to change. Hmm. It's a good thing to tell a meth addict, right? Maybe somebody who's destroying other people's emotional and mental health because they're abusive in relationships. Don't change, man. The only thing you need to change is the concept that you need to change, because that's what's really hurting you. So this is utter bollocks. This whole concept that we have brought up in our society, that our mental health needs us to have belonging and mastery of our environment and nothing else, that is totally divorced that from the virtues, is fundamentally destroying your ability to rightly perceive what you are and what you need. All societies have understood that worth is tied to virtue, not even necessarily accomplishment. Like, people can accomplish pretty tremendous things, and they're considered worthless people if they did not do it in a virtuous way. Like, this is universal, that humanity understands in its natural state, unless it's brainwashed into a false worldview and paradigm, that this is how the world works. This is natural. This is right. That a person is judged on their virtue, not upon whether or not everybody just supports them in their life choices, regardless of how destructive or profitable they are. The concept of self-esteem is the divorcing of that from virtue is an incredibly dangerous and destructive thing for you. So if you're asking the question, how do I have good self-esteem? My answer is you shouldn't, actually. Like, if you're weighing yourself properly, you probably shouldn't have especially high self-esteem. The This is coming from a guy, like, I've been reasonably successful in the things that I've put my hand at. I'm not saying I'm some kind of virtuoso or genius who's greatly impacted the world, but I've had some pretty cool experiences in my life. I've done some pretty neat things. I've gone on peacekeeping missions as an officer. I've gone on combat missions and been in combat as an officer. I've gone working in international trade relations representing the Canadian interests in Kuwait. I've represented Canada as a diplomatic attaché in the Palestine-Israeli conflict, and worked on, an international level professionalizing foreign military forces, and or at least supporting them in that effort. I've gone to the Arctic and gone to places that probably, have never seen a human foot on them before. I've, hunted whales and seals with the Inuits, and met the prime ministers, and I've gone on tremendous expeditions that are, fantastic tales of going abroad and running into polar bears, and none of that matters. Like, when you're talking about self-esteem, like mastery of your environments, okay, well, I could convince myself that because I have impacted my environment, I have 6 kids, and I love them, and so far they seem to still be rather fond of me. I have a wife who's been faithful to me in all of the things that I've done, and I'm tremendously blessed by that. But if I look at that and say, "Yeah, Neil, you're a good guy. Like, you've done some pretty cool things, and you've impacted your worlds. You're a good dude, and you should respect yourself. You should consider yourself to be a man of worth." Well, there's a fundamental problem with that, because those are not the things that actually judge a man's worth. As I've said, all historical human understanding of worth, it's tied not to those kinds of accomplishments, but to virtue. Now, some societies have considered one of the virtues perhaps being dominating other people and accomplishing great things, but the worth then is tied not to the accomplishment itself, but the virtue of having stepped out and done that. I do not weigh myself on the grounds of those things. Like, a lot of that has nothing to do with me. It just has to do with having opportunities that other people may not have had. Um, just being the right guy in the right place at the right time. I would give it a little bit of divine interference in my life to have blessed me to have all of those occasions. But those don't define my worth. My worth has to be defined on how well I meet my own virtues. And so, if the highest virtue objectively is love your neighbor as yourself, I'm not saying it is, but if it is, if that's how you look at it, then it doesn't matter how many adventures you've had, how much accomplishments you've achieved, or how many accomplishments you've achieved, how much you press on the bench, how fast you run, how many marathons you completed, how far you get in your business or in your uh, like government employment. Like, none of that is relevant to your worth. It's how well do you love other people. That's then the only merit on which to judge yourself. The And I would argue that the highest principle is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that one of the reasons people fundamentally find themselves lacking self-esteem is because they don't understand what they're not doing that they ought to be doing, and they're trying everything, but they're failing because they fall short of actually achieving that unknown goal and that unknown virtue. But here it is. Okay, so what self-esteem does. So we've ingrained it into our society, and we teach it to our children. I remember being in elementary school here in Canada and being slammed with self-esteem like all the time. Remember, we got our thumbprints, and we put them on a piece of paper. I was probably in grade 2 or 3, and we had to carry around this little certificate which said, "I'm somebody and I'm special." Like, because I had a unique thumbprint, that meant I was a worthwhile human. Okay, that's dumb. Like, it's both irrational and counterintuitive, because intuitively we know that that's not true. And that's why we fight it, because we're being introduced with this idea which creates a cognitive dissonance inside of ourselves where we we incorporate that idea into our understanding of ourselves and the world at such a young age and with such repetition that we stop even questioning that that's the right way to look at ourselves and the world. But this is the problem, is that inside we don't actually believe it. Like the soul of us knows that's not right, and it doesn't feel happy, and so, but you can't understand why, because you've trained your brain away from actually obeying your moral imperatives that are happening inside of you. I'll give you a concept that might help you understand what I'm talking about here. So you may be familiar with the statistics and you may not. But in the First and Second World War, the U.S. did a lot of studies on this to understand the psychology of combat. And they continue to do a lot to understand the psychology of combat in order to try and train their people to be as effective and ready and willing to conduct combat operations as possible. They're probably, I think, world leaders, I would argue, in that. Maybe Russia would be comparable in the amount of effort they've put into it. But after the First and Second World War, it was determined by interviews and evaluations of folks following the war that around 1 in 10 American soldiers who were actually in firefights, that were in the lines with a rifle in their hands being shot at and artilleried, that 1 in 10 actually fired a weapon intentionally aiming at another human being. So 9 out of 10 of those people either didn't fire their weapons, or they just fired them either not looking where they were firing or shooting into the ground or the sky to intentionally not hit someone. So they evaluated that this is because there is an intrinsic, at least within Western cultural society, they determined that there is an intrinsic aversion to taking human life. And I think that this is even deeper than that, of course. I think it's a natural aversion to taking human life that really all people have naturally, unless there's something broken. And you do need to work through that and to justify and figure out whether or not this is a legit thing. And that's a whole different discussion. But so we're talking 1 in 10 actually intentionally fired at a person. Now, they looked at that, and so they developed a whole system called the shoot to kill package. We adopted it here in Canada, and then we changed it to shoot to live because it was more politically correct, I guess. Shoot for him to die so that I can live, I guess. Yeah, anyway. So, shoot to kill. What they basically did is they created all the targetry that you used from a recruit and then all of your follow-on training. The targetry was a picture, man-sized, shaped, and a picture of a German soldier with a bayonet, and he's charging, and he's like, ah, right? Helmet and stuff. Some really important things about that. The German is not pointing his rifle at you. He's just running towards you with a grimace on his face, and he has a bayonet, so there's a level of threat there, and he's uniformed, but he's not actually at that moment threatening your life. They also had a picture of what's called the Hun's head, and it's about, yay high, and it's just a soldier's head with the same grimace, but no weapon present, right? And then they train you to shoot at that target, and then they train you as the target comes up, and then it goes down, to shoot at it as soon as it's exposed and as soon as it presents itself. What this did is that by the Vietnam War, all of the soldiers had been trained through this program. The incidence of soldiers reporting that they actually fired with intentional aim at enemy soldiers when in firefights went up to 70% from 10. Now, here's the interesting question. What actually happened there? It didn't change the natural inclinations. All they did was they short-circuited it by turning the action of shooting another person into a muscle memory so that there was no intentional thought engaged in it. Previously, all of the training had been round targets, and when you put your rifle up and you point it at a human being, that's not the same thing as shooting a round target. So then the brain engages, and all of the things you have learned and all of the emotions that you have, the empathy about taking a human life starts to engage, and then you have to ask questions, can I do this? But when you train people over years to just point at the human and pull the trigger, even when he's not necessarily threatening you, even when he's just presented his head, all of a sudden you've bypassed all of the natural instinct and all of the learned instincts, and you've created a muscle memory instinct where the soldiers are going to just go ahead and engage the target. And then that's even the terminology, like take out the target. It's not a human, it's just a target. You've dehumanized it. Now this is very effective in the moment, and then afterwards, people fall apart because they have been lied to, and they have themselves lied to themselves about what they were doing. They, their mind has been trained to think of other humans as targets, and then they they do that and they identify, these other humans as targets or even as lesser beings a lot of the time, which is natural dehumanization. And then afterwards, the realization starts to sink in. That was actually a person, and you haven't owned what you were doing, and so it starts to just rip you up inside. So you've created a psychological experiment right there where you've trained people to bypass their natural instinct. What I'm trying to tell you here is that self esteem is the same thing. You've been trained since you were like a child into this novel 150-year-old concept that you are an experiment of some psychological project to see what happens when you divorce self worth from actual virtue. And what I'm trying to tell you is the reason that you're having a problem with self esteem is because your soul is fighting against that and saying, I, I actually, you can positive self talk me all you want. You can tell me I'm worthy of respect all you want. You can tell me I'm amazing just the way that I am all you want. But I know something important that you don't seem to know, brain, and that's that I don't actually love people very well. I'm pretty bad at loving people. I'm actually quite selfish, and it hurts. And we need to do something about this, brain. And the brain's like, no, shut up. You're amazing. You're exactly the way you ought to be. Respect yourself. And then you take that concept of self-esteem, and I don't have good self-esteem. Well, what is self-esteem? Well, it's belonging and having an impact in my personal environment. Well, the problem must be those other people who aren't acknowledging me enough. I feel bad because I don't belong, and that's your fault. You need to invite me in and let me belong. That's the natural response, right? Or I need to accomplish something. It's obviously that I need more accomplishments. I need more mastery of my environment. But it's not going to help. And you can shout all you want. Like, fundamentally, I'll give you an example of something controversial here, but LGBTQ plus community goes out in the streets and they scream and they shout and they yell and they say, accept me the way that I am, accept me for who I am, you need to accept me. There's a controversy going on right now in Canada with Regency College, Christian College, and the CBC is after them because they have in their covenant, their constitution, there is a covenant that you have to sign if you go to Regent College, which says, while you are here, you will abide by Christian values, which means there will be no sex outside of a heterosexual ordained marriage. Okay? Well, they're horrified at this and they want to shut it down. They want to attack it because that's not accepting me, and that's why I don't feel good. Is because there's places like Regency College that doesn't accept me. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Nobody accepts what I believe. Like, outside of the Christian church, which is rapidly fading here in the West, I am attacked all the time. And by the LGBTQ plus and by the well, frankly, everybody that is in the world that doesn't approve of the idea of a God who actually demands something of you. Um, yeah, and you know what? I legitimately don't care because it doesn't affect me. I don't need that for self esteem. Belonging, well, uh, I don't need your approval. I don't need your approval because I have a much higher authority that I rest on, and I have his approval. And I mean, frankly, you can kill me, and I'm okay with that. If that's what needs to happen, and you need to purify your society of anyone who refuses to accept the legitimacy of your lifestyle, go for it. But the reality is that the root of that need to make everyone agree with you is self-esteem and the lie of self-esteem. You're hurting because you're not virtuous, according to the true natural virtues of man, which I'm going to go and state are love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the key virtues. You're not obeying them, and therefore you have a hole inside of you, and it hurts, and you don't know what to do with that because you've been ingrained with a false paradigm that you have muscle memory trained into your brain from your babyhood that this is actually a problem of belonging and failure to master my environment. So you either give in to assaulting others for not approving of your lifestyle, um, because that's the root of your problem, or you give yourself over to accomplishment seeking, traveling the world, meeting new people, succeeding in your career, having more family, making sure your kids succeed so you can live vicariously through their accomplishments in sports or education, and you become so accomplishment oriented, trying to fill the void which can only be filled by virtue. And historically, all mankind knew this. So you've got this lie of self esteem, and it is strangling you to death. That's what you need to escape. And what I want to tell you in the end here is that the only way to actually accomplish this in truth, to have the kind of virtue where you can look at yourself and be satisfied, is to have God's virtue imparted to you. You need that holiness that you can't possibly accomplish. Because it comes right down to it. I don't, and you don't, love your neighbor as you ought to do. Nobody does. Like you ought to strive for that. I'm not diminishing in any way that truth, but you fall short of it. Like you're selfish and you hurt people and you don't sacrifice for others, and you know in your heart that's true. And the reality is nobody, even if they are religious and they are genuine in their faith, nobody loves God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. Everybody is finds themselves distracted and falling short of that ideal. Everybody does. And the answer is not just telling yourself, oh, you're good enough, you deserve all this, you're amazing just the way you are, you don't need to change. No, like the reality is like you suck. You fall short of the goal and you fail. So you do need to change. You do need to get better. And nothing you do can undo the fact that you failed. But if you will accept that there is an offer of heavenly righteousness to fill that hole and to make up for those shortcomings, then you can really know what it is to feel the self-worth of actual purity. One more thing just to throw in at the end here. You'll remember I had talked previously, if any of you were following, about the need to cut off and to, in cultivation, to prune a plant so that it can actually come to life and produce real fruit. Well, this is one of those things. This is one of those ideologies that is false. It's a lie. It's not true. And it's a modern invention that's not rooted in any human conception outside of the Western world in modern era. You need to cut that off and get rid of it, and you need to seek virtue. And you can't find it outside of Christ. But if you prune it off, this is the biblical analogy. If you prune off those things which ought not be in your life, then you will start to see real growth. It'll start to happen for you. It'll start to come out, and you will find that there is a flourishing where previously there was nothing of value. So cut it off and let's move on together. Hooah. Cheers, guys.